from them everything!
Get back!
All right, let's get down to the brass tacks. Welcome to a historically defensible claim, in which I'll attempt to prove a connection between a historical development or situation and its modern parallel today. I know it's trite, but every history teacher likes to cite Mark Twain, who said, "History may not repeat, but it does rhyme." What I'm going to attempt here is to try and find a rhyme between two disparate historical circumstances. That's my intention, to analyze any possible lessons we can learn as a society from history, and to foster or add to important conversations about economic, social, and political issues. As an educator, that's something I try and do in my classroom, and now I'm going to try and do it on YouTube. You guys remember 300? That historically dubious action movie starring Gerard Butler, helmed by Zack Snyder? The movie was wildly successful, and in it, Leonidas and his 300 Spartans mixed it up against a vaguely exotic and certainly foreign enormous army of Persian invaders. And despite their defeat, their heroism allowed Greece to go on and gain its liberation, Western civilization, and all that good stuff. And that foreign army was composed of a lot of weird stuff, like bomb-throwing robe people, and a goat man, and dudes with masks, and this guy. That movie certainly got my blood pumping when I was in my 20s. Here's my DVD as proof. But as a student of history, I'm forced to reflect on why the story of the Spartans still resonates, especially with an audience of young white men. In the school I taught at in 2006, many of the broiest students dressed up as Leonidas and his Spartans for Halloween that October, complete with spears, shields, and no shirts. The administration and the faculty impotently objected. Now, I'm the first to admit the movie is well, kind of bad by most objective standards. It's a little silly and overwrought. It doesn't mean I didn't like it. I kind of did, but it's fundamentally an aesthetic exercise extolling the virtues of a highly militaristic and totalitarian state that practiced an ancient form of eugenics. Are the Spartans really the standard bearers of Western civilization the movie portrays them as? Are they the example that our modern society should seek to emulate? What the movie's highly stylized and violence and sex leaves out is how the Spartans got away with lines like this.
Spartans! What is your profession?
What that movie doesn't tell you is that the Spartans were able to train for a lifetime of military service on the backs of 250,000 serf laborers called Helots. You see, in order to be a Spartan citizen, you needed to be born of 2 Spartiate parents. Only then did they bother with the check for defects, infanticide, then lifetime of military training crap. You see, Spartan men from their 7th birthday were taken into a program of intense military training. Ancient warfare in Greece required intense unit cohesion. Men formed up in an interlocking phalanx and then pushed at their opponents for a few hours on flat, level ground. If you broke and ran, you were screwed. Most casualties in a Greek battle happened when one side's phalanx broke down and the individual soldiers in it, called hoplites, ran away, and then they would get run down by their opponents. In response, the Spartan state sought to make men who would stand in place, who would never break, who were physically strong with incredible discipline and cohesion. But that takes time. Most Greek soldiers owned small farms and brought their own equipment, called a panoply, to battle for the occasional border war against a neighboring city. Citizenship was intimately tied to military service in most Greek city-states during the classical period. Sparta took this to the extreme. They divorced their citizens from having to actually farm so that they could train all day. Men lived in a common barracks during their 20s and could only see their wives if they snuck out at night. They ate their meals together in a permanent brofest, where they consumed, supposedly, the grossest food in ancient Greece, to toughen them up.
The only way any of this worked is because someone else, really a lot of someone else's, did all the actual work for the Spartans.
These were the Helots. They weren't Lacedaemonian like the Spartans. They were considered to be ethnically different. They were Messenian Greeks. Messenia was a region next to Laconia, the Spartan homeland. It was conquered by Sparta after a long, nasty, and brutal war, its land and people expropriated by the Spartiate elite. There were very few Spartan citizens, and those citizens needed to dominate the Helots in order to maintain the Spartan lifestyle. And Spartan authorities got pretty creative in how they did this.
According to historian David Seeley, the Helots were tied to their land, turning over either half or a percentage of their produce to the Spartiate landowners. Ancient authorities often weighed in on this system as well. Thucydides, the Athenian historian of the Peloponnesian War between Athens and Sparta, indicated that Spartan foreign policy was at all times governed by the fear of a Helot rebellion. Thucydides relates a famous story in advance of a major and distant military expedition against a key Athenian base. Spartan authorities asked the Helots to nominate the men most deserving of freedom. 2,000 such men were selected and celebrated their newfound emancipation, until the Spartans disappeared them all in a black bag operation designed to decapitate any potential Helot leadership. And Plutarch, the ancient biographer, describes a secret police force called the Cryptia.
By this ordinance, the magistrates dispatched privately some of the ablest young men into the country, from time to time, armed only with their daggers, and taking a little necessary provision with them. In the daytime they hid themselves in out-of-the-way places, and there lay close. But at night issued out into the highways and killed all the Helots they could light upon. Sometimes they set upon them by day, as they were at work in the fields, and murdered them.
Plutarch also reports the Helots were subjected to various instances of public humiliation by Spartan leadership. So what have we got here? A highly militarized state composed of a relatively small, well-trained, and heavily armed force. The force counts on the produce and labor of an ethnically different underclass to contribute the food and resources they need to maintain their barracks lifestyle and military training regimen. In addition, this underclass is consistently terrorized and humiliated by the Spartans. The United States has a population of about 330 million people. About 420,000 of those people are law enforcement officers. In recent decades, our nation's police has become increasingly militarized. Starting in the 1990s, American police departments took advantage of a program called 1033. It seems to be an outgrowth of the war on drugs and the tough on crime policies of the Clinton administration, allowing police departments to purchase billions of dollars worth of surplus Army equipment, including armored vehicles, aircraft, night vision goggles, ponchos, tents, and automatic weapons. 8,000 law enforcement agencies have availed themselves of this program. There's about 18,000 law enforcement agencies in the United States as a whole. In addition, a majority of police forces in major urban areas don't live in the cities they police. According to Nate Silver at 538, in 75% of the cities with the largest police forces, 60% of the officers live outside of the city. This number is even more stark when the ethnicity of the officers is taken into account. For example, in New York City, about 60% of the officers live in the city limits, but only about 45% of white officers do. Finally, is the funding of these institutions. Increasingly in different parts of the country, local police forces are turning to ticketing and asset forfeiture as a way of raising money. In a recent investigation series by the Greenville News, local police departments routinely confiscated cash and goods belonging to people somehow involved in interactions with the police. According to this report, about 20% of individuals subjected to confiscation weren't even charged with a crime, arrested, or ticketed. This confiscatory regime imposes the biggest burden on communities of color. Between 2014 and 2016, black men accounted for 65% of asset forfeitures in South Carolina, and white South Carolinians were twice as likely to get their goods or money returned if the seizure was considered unjustified. The city of Chicago draws around 10% of its entire annual budget from tickets, asset forfeiture, and other fees. It adds up to over $1 billion. So, why does this happen? Asset forfeiture and aggressive ticketing raise revenue to maintain police department funding. Communities throughout the United States include asset forfeiture as a revenue line in most annual budgets. Despite recent lawsuits by the ACLU and others, the practice of policing for profit is still the norm in many parts of the country, as government officials seek to push the burden of maintaining the criminal justice apparatus onto the individuals that interact with it, whether they're charged with a crime or not. This is not a criticism of the police and their largely well-meaning efforts to enforce the law. It's more concern that aggressive and more militarized policing born out of the war on drugs is potentially damaging our country's social fabric.
In the Andy Griffith Show of the 1960s, Andy Griffith played the genial and understanding Sheriff Andy Taylor, a cop so benign he didn't even carry a gun. I know this clip has done the rounds on social media, but it's worth referencing here.
Tell me, Sheriff Taylor, why don't you carry a gun?
Oh, I don't know. When a man carries a gun all the time, the respect he thinks he's getting might really be fear. So I don't carry a gun because I don't want the people of Mayberry to fear a gun. I'd rather they would respect me.
So what can we make of all this? Are militarized police forces, funded at least in part by asset forfeitures and aggressive ticketing, the practice that helped cause the dispute that led to the death of Michael Brown in Ferguson, Missouri, the new Spartans? I'm not sure. However, we're on some dangerous ground. In the era of mass incarceration, there has been an increasing level of criticism from both the left and in libertarian quarters on the right about the militarization of the police and increasingly heavy-handed police tactics. The expansion of SWAT teams across all police departments, even in largely suburban or rural areas, is a troubling sign about the expansion of a military ethos across American police departments. The disproportionate deployment of these teams in urban areas with largely minority populations is also a danger. Also, this police apparatus is expensive, and in the age of declining public funding and calls for austerity, police have increasingly been asked to use the collection of wealth from the population in the execution of law enforcement functions as a means to fund their own departments.
Does this set up an increasingly Spartan Helot-style relationship between police departments and the communities they serve, shifting from essentially a force for order to a force for exploitation and oppression? I'm not sure. But what is increasingly clear is that many communities perceive that to be happening. And in the wake of policies like stop and frisk, no-knock warrants, and the various high-profile uses of deadly force after seemingly minor infractions or confrontations, the growing recognition that in a lot of neighborhoods, there seems to be more of an occupied territory thing going on or a battle space. This is a dangerous precedent and one with ominous consequences for our social contract. Those in heavily policed areas are increasingly othered in popular discourse on the right, and this can help generate the Spartan-Helot dichotomy that dominated Spartan politics for centuries. But we must be careful, because as much as the Spartans exploited, humiliated, and terrorized their Helot population, they were increasingly dependent on them economically, and the Spartan system of military training came to be inextricably linked to the Helots. When Sparta was defeated in 362 BCE by Thebes, a rival city-state, the Thebans liberated the Helots and their territory of Messenia as a way of crippling Sparta's military manpower. Aristotle reflected on this danger in his work, The Politics, claiming that the matter of the Helots was a constant source of strife and anxiety for the Spartans. And that anxiety contributed to harsher and harsher measures historically, especially after Helot rebellions. Thucydides believed that every foreign policy decision of the Spartans was grounded in their need to subdue any possible Helot unrest. We must guard against creating a parasitic relationship between police departments increasingly dependent on fees and forfeitures associated with law enforcement and the population that police department serves. There's a danger for a vicious cycle. Increased militarization of law enforcement and asset forfeitures, not to serve the community through crime prevention, but to serve the continued militarization of the police to ensure order against an increasingly alienated urban population. There's much debate in a variety of studies I found about the efficacy of SWAT teams and heavily armed and kitted out police forces in actually reducing crime rates. We must guard against even the perception that the police become a new Cryptia, an outside force using aggressive tactics after years of arming and military training against an ethnically different underclass increasingly exploited for its already limited wealth and labor. In a recent Vox article by journalist Herman Lopez, he asked our society to weigh the costs of some law enforcement policies. It's unclear the extent to which the increased militarization of the police actually prevents much crime. In studies and articles I've found from Princeton to the ACLU to the Koch Foundation, doubt is cast on the extent to which more heavily armed police actually prevent much crime. But we have to consider the psychological and emotional impact of militarizing law enforcement in American cities. Sparta built its system of military training to preserve the independence of their city-state in the dog-eat-dog world of ancient Greece. But increasingly, and as time went on, that system existed not for the defense of Sparta, but to perpetuate itself, which led to greater and greater oppression of a permanently disenfranchised class of serfs. This is perhaps a greater danger given the steady and consistent fall of national crime rates.